Welcome to this DMP challenge. This is Garrett Fry, and we are looking at a single frame from the cemetery sequence over at the VFX Horde. It's really cool to be doing these DMP challenges with you, but when we get to use live action footage, it just makes it that much more real. Just for your information, the sequence is not available to the public until later this year, but you can get early access to it if you pledge right now. So the deadline for pledging is May 12th, and then you will get access to the sequence the following week. That means you get access to all of the film footage, the tracked 3D cameras, all of the 3D assets, and DMP references included with the sequence. So just head over to the VFX Horde /pledge to see all the information about this current sequences and the other sequences that are offered right now for the VFX Horde. So the way that we are going to be modeling this DMP challenge review video off of is a daily session. So if you are able to make a certain pledge level where you get access to all of the VFX Horde sequences, then you'll be admitted to a special group where you get to participate in daily sessions where we will be reviewing your work. So the only difference between the example that we're doing here and what you would do in that group is that group would actually be looking at real film footage, like the whole sequences, where this we're just looking at one frame. Also, I just want to make clear that everything the VFX Horde does is modeled after what is actually done in Visual Effects Studios. So this is a daily session, but it's a virtual one, obviously. So before we get into this actual daily session, I want to talk a little bit about what happens in a real VFX studio during a daily session. So this is a typical dailies room for a visual effects studio. So you can see that there's some seating in here, there's the screen, and then what you can't see in the back here is there's a projector back there. So this is a smaller screening room. So normally a studio will have a bunch of these smaller screening rooms, maybe with a couple more rows of chairs back here. And then they'll have maybe a larger screening room where they can put a lot of people in there. So depending on the studio that you work, they're going to have these special screening rooms. And what you can't see in the back here is there's actually a projector. And this projector is a special projector that is very expensive, that has been color calibrated to what they are outputting to the client. And so this screening room has several purposes. The first purpose is to review people's work and to have people look at it and to comment and critique. The other reason is to act as a filter. So if you think of this daily session as this filter here, everybody's work that they're working on, everybody has their own computer monitor that they're doing their work from, and then all that work has to get funneled through the dailies room in order to get approved by the visual effects supervisor. So that way there's a continuity to the things that they're delivering. They're making sure that all of the color looks good and your black levels are right, and technically everything is looking good, and all these shots look like they belong together. Because if everybody's working on their different monitors, they have different color calibrations for their different monitors, and they could be producing vastly different things within the same sequence or within the same show, which is not good at all. So everything has to go through the screening room. And that's why if you work at a visual effects studio and you're like, hey, my stuff looks really great, and then you get into the dailies room and it looks pretty bad because of the change between your monitor and what's seen through the projector, it doesn't really matter what your monitor says. You have to make your work look good in a screening room. That's why when I teach people in the MPC Academy, I'm always telling them to grab, if they can, grab their work and borrow one of the screening rooms, maybe over lunch or something, and take a look at their work and just make sure that their work is looking good before they show it in a dailies or before they show it in a crucial dailies. So so this monitor here is really important. Typically we have, the seating here. So usually right here, right in the front row, we have the VFX supervisor that's working there. You could have your lead or other people that, producer, other important people typically sit right there in the front row. So if you're new to Dailies, you don't come in and just sit right in the front row, because that's kind of reserved for the people that need to see the work. So usually they're sitting right there in the front. Depending on the way the Dailies is set up, the visual effects supervisor, if he's showing something to a client, let's say that this isn't a lead, but it's the client, then he's the visual effects supervisor is the one who is driving the Dailies. And what I mean when I say driving the Dailies is that he's running the projector, and he's in what order the shots are being seen in. So he's the one that's controlling all of that. He's the one that's making notes on it. And then typically, like scattered throughout here, maybe on the second row or throughout, you have chords, which is the coordinators. And they're the ones that are writing down all the information that is talked about in this meeting. Okay. And so, and then with the coordinators, you have other people in here, and these are the artists. Okay. So these artists are sitting in here. They've been invited to come to these dailies to take a look at their work. Typically, there's conversation that goes on. There's a conversation that goes on between the client and the VFX supervisor. And that's really the only conversation that's going on. So, and then it's being recorded by somebody in production, like what's going on. The artists are here, even though it's their work that's being seen on the screen, they are pretty much silent. They don't really say anything unless they're asked a specific question, or if they can strategically say something that clarifies maybe what the VFX supervisor is saying. But typically in these meetings, the artists don't really say anything. They're just there to observe and to hear directly the interplay, the exchange between the VFX supervisor and the client. So that's for larger Dailies reviews. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes the client won't be there. Sometimes the client will be in a conference. It's like a conference call, video conferencing, and they're maybe in LA or something like that. And the VFX supervisor is communicating with them video conferencing, and they're both looking at shots together. And in this case, it's actually really hard to hear. And so typically under this scenario, as an artist, you don't really talk at all, because they can't hear you very well over the video conferencing anyways. And if you talk, then it just adds more noise to what's going on. Also, let's say in this scenario, let's say we have, this isn't the VFX supervisor, but let's say it's the lead. Let's say it's your lead. And then if it's your lead, he's typically the one that's driving. And then you'll have somebody here that's a production coordinator or something that's recording things. And then you have the artists back here. So normally these daily sessions are a bit more relaxed. You can discuss things more directly with your lead. And that's not really a problem, but still there's a bit of an etiquette to all of this. You need to make sure that you are, not, monopolizing the conversation. It's the lead, it's his meeting, and he's conducting it. So he's pulling up specific shots on the shows, and then he is taking a look. So that's if it's just between the lead and his artists there. So sometimes it's between the lead, and right here in this chair, we have the VFX soup, okay? So that's another scenario. The lead, and then the lead is talking directly to the VFX soup. So this is a meeting between the VFX lead and the VFX soup, And now these people are here, all the artists are here observing. So they can observe, and it's the same kind of rules apply, is that if there's a direct question, if there is something that you can do to clarify, then you can speak up. I always tell people that it's a little bit like your trump card. You only have a couple of these, and so you have to be strategic about what you say or when you speak in these dailies rooms to make sure that what you're saying actually is really contributing to the conversation and helping, because just talking in these meetings, it's very non-productive, and there's so much information that's going through these meetings that it's really a necessity to have people not speak in these meetings so that the lead and the VFX supervisor can get things worked out. And so typically, if you are an artist here and you have a question, you can say, hey, I have a really quick question. Just to clarify, you mean you want this to be a bit brighter? And they say, oh, actually, that's not what I meant. I didn't say brighter. I actually meant more saturated, So there is an opportunity for you in these dailies rooms to be asking clarifying questions, but you want to be sparing in those. The other option is after the daily session, you go and you talk to your lead and say, hey, you know what? I was a little bit confused in there because he had said this and then he changed his mind and he said this. So what is it do you think that he really wants in this circumstance? And then the lead, it's his job to clarify exactly what the VFX supervisor wants, because he is the one that's he or she is the one that's ultimately responsible for everything that goes up on that screen, to be seen by the VFX supervisor. So that's just a brief overlook of how dailies are done at Visual Effects Studios. There's definitely a lot more that we could talk about, especially when we're talking about you as an artist being successful in dailies and how to produce consistent work that's hitting notes that the leads can depend on you for, and the visual effects supervisor loves to see your work. So we're going to put that conversation off till another time, and we're going to get going with our dailies session here. And this description has kind of given you that brief overview so that you know that even though we're doing this virtual daily session, that it's really rooted in Visual Effects Studios and how they do dailies. And so, no, we're not sitting next to each other, but I will be acting as your lead in this review, and I'll be taking a look at your work and critiquing your work. So it's very common at a visual effects studio to have the original source footage loaded and then to compare people's work against that. So the first artist that we're looking at here is Victor. So Victor, I can see that you have added several of these gravestones here, one here and several in the back there. And the placement and the position of those look great. They look natural. I'm going to go ahead and make some comments. So I can see that there is a slight color difference. So this one looks red. This one looks red. This one looks blue. And then this one looks a little too red. Okay. So these gravestones are kind of hard because they're this middle gray color. And it's really hard to nail that exact color, because if you're just a little bit off, it's going to stand out. And so that's what that stands out to me, that those look red, this one looks blue. So that's to begin with. Now, if we take a look at this guy, I'm looking particularly at this highlight side here. It looks flashed, which means that it's been brought up from the bottom, and it has this kind of washed over look. So if we compare that to what is on the original, so you can see here on the original that there is there's a really hot spot in specific areas, and that hot spot is like not very like it doesn't take over everything. So we can see that this is hotter than this area down here. So this has a slightly darker value than this hotspot here. and this right here is not as hot as this right here. So if the light is coming from this direction, then these surfaces right here are going to have the most hot, and then this is going to be less hot. And so when I'm talking about hot, I'm talking about how much light is hitting it and how much that light is reflecting back. So that's what I'm talking about there. So, so what I'm missing on your piece here is that it's consistently hot throughout. So, so it's two things. One is that the whole thing is kind of flashed, like instead of it feeling like it's really bright, it just feels a bit washed out. So on your curves, I just make sure you're pulling up from the top and not pulling up from the bottom. The bottom will flash it, the top will make it a bit brighter. And then to have some variation in this. So so like on this one here, this surface and this surface, those are exactly the same value. So you want to have some variation between this surface and this surface, but you also want to have variation within the surface, right? Because there should be some kind of maybe just a little bit of fall off between this side and this side. If it's slightly angled or something like that, then there needs to be just a little bit of variation. Like I see it a little bit right here, where it's a little bit brighter right here, and it's a little bit darker over here, and that's great. But I think it needs to be consistently throughout. Also on this thing, I can see that you've added a shadow right here, okay? So I know that because of this base, there's a certain distance. So it's like from here to here. That's the distance, and then we have another distance between the base of this and the tree. So I know that there's about maybe this much distance between the tree and the tip of this. However, you've put a shadow right behind this obelisk, right there. So it makes it feel like this obelisk is sitting right next to the tree, right up here, but we can see visually that that's not possible because there's all these things that would distance it from this tree. So that's something else to look at there. Also, when you compare the black levels here, I know that I would be looking at this guy right here, and this is your addition right here. I would be looking at this guy right here, and do you see how it's just a little bit wet or something up there? I would just put that in there just to make sure that it integrates. So this base right here and this base should look almost exactly the same. So put a little bit of that wet up there. Make sure you match the color a little bit more. And so there's a bit of like they look the same. So this one here, I know that I've told you that some of these look red and stuff, but the red on this is a little more brown and this is a little more brighter. So also, I would just want to make sure that your values are the right value. So if you take a look, so if I were to just compare this guy here to this value right here, then this one is much brighter and much bluer, and this is a bit darker. And then, you know, that is... some of these have a shadow side to them, and so this is much, much darker than some of these over here. So I think overall, the ones that you've added are a bit bright. This one is good, actually. This value, perfect. I think that's great. This one is too bright, this one is too bright, this one is too bright. So I think all three of those are too bright. And then what you should do is go through and do a comparison. Go through and cut out a little piece. Go to the original plate here. So let me just flip to that. So go to the original plate and cut out a piece like right there in your Photoshop file and then put it on top of your piece. And I would do that in these little areas here. And I would just, that's how I would match the values. Cut out little pieces, stick them on top, and take a look and see if all your values are looking correct. Also, and I think, let's just take a look. Yeah, because I feel like the dark values here are also a bit flashed if you compare those two. Okay, and then this area here is getting super dark. And so what we have here is we're going into super darks. So now what we're going to do, now that we've taken a look at Victor's work and we've identified some issues, we're going to do a couple different tests that are very common that are done in daily sessions, which is the exposure test and the saturation test. So I told you that these look a bit red. So let's put a saturation on top of this, and let's take a look. So we can see now that we've put this, we put a saturation curve on it. And in daily sessions, they are using viewers that have saturation, so they can crank up the saturation a lot. And so you can see the high saturation levels on these guys. Like this is clearly red. This is clearly red. This is clearly red. This is clearly red. And actually, I thought this was blue, but it's really kind of coming out red. So, and then this one is clearly red. But let's compare that to the plate there, so we can see. So this is a pretty red thing. It has a bit of a red cast. So I think that's appropriate. The way the coloration of this, so that's working, but these do feel a bit red. And maybe one of them is a bit more red, but then they need to be more of this neutral color, because most of these have this neutral color, and this is the only one in the plate that has that red to it. So yeah, so go ahead and make those changes. So the next one is the exposure test. So now I'm just cranking up an exposure and taking a look. And so this will often, show some of the most dark areas here. And so this area right here, I can just tell you, if we compare that to the plate, that we are seeing into those shadows quite a bit, and we're having all kinds of bounce reflect light in here, and it's just, these are like little black holes right in there. So yeah, so those are a bunch of different notes to go forward with Victor's work. Okay, so now we're taking a look at Maura's work. So I'm going to pop that on and off. So we can see as we pop this on and off that there's quite a bit that's been added. And so the comments that I have here for Maura is that first off is this idea of pixel density. So I can immediately tell that this, the resolution of this object or this gravestone here is at a different pixel density than the tree behind it. So this is a bit lower res. And so when you're going through your photo reference, you need to make sure that you are identifying the correct the resolution that's going to work. So if you have your plate here, you've double resed it, right? Because that's typically what we do in matte painting, is we take that frame and we double the resolution, and then we pull reference on top. And so our reference needs to be at least 1.5 times the resolution. So you pull that in there, and if your gravestone that you've pulled in is like this big, and then you scale it up to be really big to fit into this spot, then obviously this is going to be softer and this is going to be sharper. So that's how you control that. You just have to make sure, and there's really nothing you can do to fix this. You have to use a different image. You could, in some cases, go on top of it and add a little bit of detail here and there to kind of trick the eye in making, the audience feel like it's a different resolution. But that's typically not what you do, especially when you have a vast photo library that would be included with a sequence like this. You would just ditch that and go to something else. Okay. So also, I would just make sure that the perspective is correct on some of these. So you can see like this one in particular. So if you go through and you match your vanishing points down here, then it's somewhere down here, the vanishing point. So like this one, some of these are kind of in the ground and sunk and all that kind of stuff, but not to the point where the vanishing point of the top and the bottom are going to hit somewhere down here, because obviously the vanishing point is out here somewhere. So I would make sure that you do that on your perspective. Also, I would just check your values here, because I look at this one here, and this is a bit flashed. And then you look at this one, which is farther away, because typically things that are farther away, probably not in the case of this plate because it's a really clear day, but typically when things are farther away, they get brighter. So this is pretty dark, and you compare it to this one here, and this is pretty bright. It's really bright. So the contrast level on this and the dark levels need to be brought down quite a bit on that. And so that would be balancing all of these just to make sure that all of those levels are correct. Also, make sure that when your contact points are super important, to make sure that you're hitting that it doesn't feel soft. So this one here just feels a little bit soft, and then in different areas. I would make sure, like, the integration on this one that's in the plate is perfect. It looks fantastic, right? Because it's real. And all of these look really good because there's a really distinct integration point. So, but on yours, it's just a little bit of softness, and you need to have just a little bit of that occlusion shadow that's going on these. Also, the perspective on this one is a bit off, especially when you compare like this and this. It's almost flat, those two sides, and yours is like right here and here. So so that will help. So if you've been struggling putting these in here and being like, oh, they're not sitting in, I don't know why they're not sitting in like they should, and it's because the perspective is not on. And as soon as you fix that perspective, then it's like, oh, everything is sitting in much better. Also, I think that, I know we've talked about this one before, but this one right here, this appears to be at a different scale than some of the others. So, so this one here seems like it would be maybe bigger than this one. So, because of the size, or at least the same size, but it appears to be smaller. So this feels like a little miniature thing, and all of these obelisks. So actually, this obelisk should be probably that scale up there. So that's an important thing to look at, is make sure the scale is right. Also, and like this one here feels a bit too big, so I think the scale needs to go down on that one. But of course, you're going to be chucking this one out anyways and getting a new image that's higher resolution. But otherwise, I you know, like as far as the composition goes, I think it's working. I think it looks fine. And then have some like extreme foreground elements here is good. I would just make sure that your shadow crispness is the same here. I think the plate is just a little bit softer than what you have here, and make sure you just put a little bit of, you know, visual cues to kind of integrate these things into the ground a little bit more. So this is, like I said, this is Maura's submission, and there's some things for you to work on that one. All right, so now we're taking a look at Matt's work. So let's put that on and off. I can see that you've made one addition here, and as I'm flipping back and forth between these, I think the biggest thing that stands out is the perspective on this. So if I'm looking at this, the perspective, and I follow these perspective lines back, they're going to be, and then I follow this here, they're going to be converging somewhere around here. So the vanishing point is way up here. You could say that it's because it's being sunk into the ground and it's not the right, you know, just like some of these that are, you know, that are not really sitting in the ground straight. Even under those circumstances, I think there would be a bit more of like a visual cue that because it feels like this is sitting on the ground and it feels like this is sitting on the ground, if that makes sense. So there's not like a piece of broken stuff and a shadow or something like that would give this indication that it is like almost going to fall towards us, towards the camera. And there's not, I think, enough foreshortening to make it feel like this is coming towards us. Because if this is really tipped towards us, towards the camera, then I think we would start to see this thing just be a little bit bigger at the top here, and there would be a little more foreshortening, but I guess I'm not really seeing that there. So mostly on this one, you know, I think the note is to continue on with this. I see that you have put in this one here. To continue on, I would put more gravestones throughout there, you know, because that's the note for the shot, is to replace this thing and to put more gravestones throughout. And so I would continue on with that and then make sure that your perspective is correct. I would not try to fight with this piece of image reference. I would find a different photo of this same gravestone that is closer to the perspective that you want, and then I would match that. But to take this and to like cut it apart and to deconstruct it and to put it all back together is a lot of work when you have the photo reference there. So just find one that works, and it's gonna be much better for you. And then, like I said, put through more gravestones throughout. I think there's also like a color when you compare this obelisk that you have to what's in the plate. The plate is a lot more golden. It's a lot more warm, and then your work is a lot cooler. It's a lot more blue. So if we did that saturation test, we would see that those are a little bit all over the place. And if we did this exposure test, and that seems like that's working out okay as far as the values go. I think it's mostly the color on that because it's a bit blue. All right, so now we are taking a look at Joaquim's work here. So if we flip this back on and off here, we can see the difference that we have. So there's been a lot of gravestones added, which is cool. Like, I like that. So that was the note, was to fill up this graveyard with gravestones, and I think that's been done here. What I do like is that there is a lot of variety, and I don't feel like there's a repetition or anything of these elements. So what I am noticing is that there's an overall sharpening of the image, which I'm not exactly sure what is coming from, if that is like the filtering or something that, you know, that you're putting out. But like if you compare this image, and I don't know if you can tell through the Facebook or through this YouTube video here, the difference in sharpening, but this is the original plate, and it has a certain softness level, and all plates are going to have that kind of softness level. So you're going to want to average a little bit of your images so that they're not too sharp. Your images need to be consistently have that same kind of sharpness level. Typically, we leave the softening of matte painting elements to the compositor, and so we'll deliver things just a little bit sharp, and then the compositor will blur them to integrate them into the shot. Or you would include your own blur nodes when you deliver them to compositing to say, hey, I'm suggesting this as a solution. I gave them a little bit sharp to you, but they need to be a little bit soft. So two things really is that the sharpening of your elements compared to the plate, but what you've done here is sharpen the whole image, because when you are delivering something to to compositing, really the only thing that you're delivering is just these elements here. You're not replacing the complete plate, and so you can't do a filter on the whole plate because you're just delivering these elements all on separate layers typically, and you're going to hand them all off to comp, and then they're going to integrate them into the plate. So if you make changes out here to the quality or to the color or something like that, then that's something that can't be done in comp because you're doing it in Photoshop. So that's something to be aware of. Leave the sharpening of the plate alone, especially when you're doing matte painting. If you're doing a piece of concept art or something like that, then that might be appropriate, of course. But where you're just responsible for the elements that you're adding, then you can't make additions to the other places. So right away, let's take a look at some of this stuff. So I feel like I feel like some of these are done quite successfully. Like this guy here, this guy here. This has some interest and stuff. I would just make sure that when you are putting these in, and I can see that you're putting these in these like dappled lights and stuff, but I look at the value of this gravestone on the backside, and I would just make sure that you're hitting these, at least some of these, with some of that darker value. Like even this guy here compared to this guy, I think this one is slightly a darker value than this one here. So I would just make sure that you just hit those down a little bit. And I guess now that I'm looking at it, I think consistently with all of the ones that you've added, that the shadow side is just not quite there. I think you need to bring it down quite a bit. Something that you could do as just as a test is to grab a little splotch of this, grab that, move it over here and put that little splotch there. So this is from the plate. You move it to this gravestone right here. And here on this gravestone, you can see that it's really dark. And so while it's sitting here, you can use your adjustment layers in Photoshop and just bring this down, make it darker and darker and darker so that it matches what's in the plate. And if it's matching what's in the plate, then you know that it's correct. I think the overall weakest points of this image is this guy here, because compositionally it's a bit plain. There's nothing going on. It's this big solid color, and it's framed in such a kind of an uninteresting way. And so I would look at alternatives for this. So just get something new. Put something in there that's a bit more interesting, and then for this guy here, the way I'm looking at the way that it's been cut out, something also you just need to make sure that when you're doing is that when you are cutting these out from the photo reference, that it's being done in a way that that feels natural. I think this right here feels a little bit like a cutout, and I think there's a couple of things that add to that, is because this is against a brighter sky, and so I think it just makes it pop, where some of these that you've done, I think they integrate a lot better because they're against these like multicolor backgrounds. So where it's against a little bit of a brighter area here and it's a bright object against a dark background, then I think it feels a little cut out there. So just make sure when you're masking this out that you're doing it in like a really nice way. Also, I think at this integration point, it feels just a bit fuzzy right there. And this base right here, I'm not buying the, I don't feel like I'm buying it, and I'm looking at the perspective on this. So this guy, I think he needs help. I think the perspective is not quite right, and because if you are going to do this extreme perspective, like this thing is like falling into the ground, then you have to have enough things on the ground that's giving it visual cues that it is toppling over. And so I don't think there's enough there to kind of buy it as that, because normally, I mean, you go, oh, here's my horizon line, everything's gonna converge on that because it's because they're all boxes essentially, that can converge at this point. But when you're toppling something over, then it has a bit of a different, vanishing point for that. And so you need to have something in the ground that says, hey, I'm toppled over. And I don't think that this is succeeding on that. So like I said, all of this I think is working really well as far as that. If you darken up those dark values, and I would get rid of this guy and I would get rid of this guy, or find maybe a different reference or something. Also, something like this. If we compare this original here, we can see that the perspective on this, like we're really seeing on top of these surfaces, right? Because it's falling towards us, and we can see, and it's in the foreground, so we can see on top of these surfaces really well. As these gravestones go back, we can see that there's less and less that we see on top of these surfaces here until it just becomes very, very small, right? So as things come closer to camera, we're going to see more on top of them because, the perspective becomes a lot more extreme. So if we take a look at yours, it looks almost as if you grabbed this from a photo where it was farther back. Okay, so if you're going to be using something right here, it should be not something like in a photo that you're grabbing that's far away. It should be something that's really in the foreground where we can see more on top of these things. And I know that you're kind of tilting it away from camera, and so it kind of it kind of does that, but really, like, you look at this, that's like flat right there, and this is really, I don't know, so the perspective is not correct on this. So I like the best thing to do instead of fighting with this is to find a photo where you have a gravestone that's in the foreground. And if it's in the foreground, then you can then you know that the perspective is correct and everything. As opposed to it being in the far background and then trying to make it work like it's in the foreground, because they will have different perspectives is the point that I'm making. Alternatively, if you do get access to the sequence and all the 3D files, then you could use a 3D object in front of this, or you could use because actually this particular obelisk, I think, is in the 3D library. So if you were going to take this work and apply it to the sequence, to the live action footage, I would say get rid of this completely. Get the 3D image, do a or the 3D model, render it so that it has the correct perspective, and then compare that to what you've got. I think you'll see the big difference. And then what I would do is I'd take this image that you have here and kind of overlay it on the 3D render, and just to bring it up to that photoreal level. So you're basically kind of using this image that you have here as a kind of a texture, and you're kind of overlaying that on the 3D model to bring it up to that photoreal level. But I would use the 3D model definitely in this area instead of this image here, and render that. Okay, I'm looking at Ishian's work. So Ishian, I'm turning on and off your work and looking at the plate. So we can see here that you've added a bunch of stuff. And so the biggest things that I want to point out to you here is this guy here, the placement of him, because on the original plate we could see back into the plate a lot more, and there's some really interesting things going on there. And so I think the placement of this is not the best. So I think if we moved it over, put it somewhere else so that it didn't obscure that view. Also, it's kind of hitting right there at the bottom of the frame, which is creating a tangent. And so typically we don't want to rest things at the bottom of the frame. We want to lift it up or move it over or put it completely off frame. But having it be like really close there, I think that's not a good spot for it. So overall, I think it needs to be put into a different area. Also, as far as the color and value, when I look at this value and this value, they look almost exactly the same. I mean, from here, they look the same. These almost look the same. If you're looking at these surfaces here, you can tell they all have different values because they're all they're facing the light in different areas. And so at different directions rather. So you want to make sure that you're describing the shape of the gravestone by making these different values. So if it's not there in the resource photography, then you have to recreate it by putting masks and stuff in there. Also, I think you should go through and check all of your perspective on, at least on these foreground ones, check the perspective. A good way to do that is, if you were to get access to the 3D files through the pledging and stuff, then you could have the 3D model of this. So you could either render the actual 3D model of this and overlay it with photography to bring it up to that photoreal level, or you can simply just bring the camera in, the plate into Maya and this 3D model and place it in 3D, and so you can get a good idea on the perspective. Because when I am looking at this perspective here, it looks like the horizon line is kind of far up here, when the horizon line is down here. Okay, and it doesn't look like it's falling over really per se, that because it's sitting in the ground here and here. I don't see any visual cues on the ground that would say that this thing is toppling over. It just looks like the wrong perspective on that. So either you need, so what I would suggest in the very least is to bring this image into Maya and put in some cubes or something to get an idea of the perspective. And so so the perspective on this is not correct. Also, it's a bit green. When you look at this color and this color, you can see how warm the tree trunk is and how green this is here, especially on the shadow side and on this side here, so that those two, they don't really feel like they sit in the same world. Otherwise, I think some of these are sitting really nicely in the plate. These guys here, I think maybe the only thing is putting in that shadow side to describe that shape some more. You can see that this has that distinct shadow side. I guess it's that one that you've put in. So this one has a shadow side, has a light side. That looks great. It's this one here probably, and this one. This one has a little bit of a light side coming from that direction. So it should have a light side on this side. So go ahead and flip that one so that has that. Also, this guy right here, there's a light side on this side of your source photography, but the light should be coming from this area. So you could go ahead and flip that, have the light side on this side, and then you can adjust it further with your adjustment layers. So with all of that, I think that would be a better image. But like I said, maybe relook at this one, because this is as a very plain faced one, and then the perspective on this one and the position, so I would try several different options in these two positions. These are really kind of important spots because they're the hero things. Like I said, these things are more or less working back here. It's these foreground ones that need help. So now we're taking a look at Damien's here. So let's take a look. And as I flip these on and off, we can see what's been done here. So let's go ahead and make some of these comments. So Damien here, this guy here, well, I guess first of all, the note was to replace this guy. So if you watch that video on the VFX Horde, it says to replace this guy. So I would, to hit that note, I would do something with this. And then I would get rid of this as a way of hitting that note. So it's really important, especially in the context of, simulating a visual effects environment. If you were to put this in front of Dailies and the note was to replace this, and you didn't replace that, then they would be looking at that and they would not be happy. So, you can, of course, in the context of this DMP challenge, you can do whatever you want. But to hit that note and to kind of follow after that simulated VFX environment, you would definitely need to watch, make sure that you watch the notes and you follow them. But technically, when we're looking at this, the perspective is incorrect on this. And so like with the other people that I've suggested, because if you look at this, it's like all of these are converging and they're and the horizon line somewhere around here, I guess, when the horizon line is up there. So it's like this is kind of dropped in the frame a little bit. The distance between this and this is kind of a bit strange, and then to have these converging on the wrong horizon line is incorrect. So I think the best thing to do is to maybe go into 3D, put some cubes together, and figure out what the perspective is. That would be the easy thing, and then. Or just do a mapping out and making sure that all of these are converging on the same horizon line, because it does feel like it sits like it's sitting right on top of the ground. So all of your perspective horizon line things would apply to this. So that's not correct there. Also, I would say on this one as well. So like if we're looking at this, um, it looks like the horizon line would be somewhere around here, which is below. So if it's like this, it would really need to be, you know, something like this so that they're converging up here on this line. You know, you can always take a look at what's on the plate, because if you look at these, my lines aren't very straight here, but you can see that they're all converging somewhere around here on this. And there might be slight variations because they're kind of tilting a little bit, but they're all going around this area. And so when yours are going off into this direction and stuff, then it doesn't look correct. So perspective is a big thing. I just make sure that you hit that really hard. Also, your integration points here. This is looking pretty good over on this side. I would just make sure on this side that you put a little more care into that. And then there's a value difference. So if you look at this guy here and this guy here, which is maybe the closest comparison, this one is really bright as far as the value. This one is pretty dark. Make sure that this dark side is here. And this is in shadow here, so I would assume that it would be just as dark as this guy here because they're kind of that lighter stone. So I would definitely make that more dark. Also, we can do our exposure our exposure test here just to make sure that we're not putting anything that's super dark. So when I'm looking at this, it seems like maybe some of these values in here are just a little bit dark. The only thing that I'm seeing is like these little cracks and things. And so maybe that's okay, but it just appears maybe it's just a little bit dark on your dark values here. Also, you can see that this is probably a little bit flashed if you're comparing these values here where it's hitting the ground and this guy here where it's pretty bright right there. So just, you know, doing that exposure test, saturation test, it seems like you're maybe okay a little bit. This is a little bit red, this is a little bit red, that's a little bit red. So you can hit those probably just a little bit better. But overall, I think it's working. I think this guy and this guy, and then the value on this. And then I think this guy's sitting a little bit too high. I think he needs to be dropped down. So if he's hitting there, I think that would work out a lot better for that. So yeah, so good job on that image. Okay, I am taking a look at Cuate's work here. So I'm gonna flip back and forth here. Something, so we can see some of the biggest things, like it looks like there was a lot of work done to get rid of this tree right here. So, so two things on that. So one, if you're following the shot brief, that was not included in that to remove that tree. Number two is that tree is actually really cool. And so when you're looking at your work, or the plate that you're working on, you want to say, what is it in that plate that looks really nice? What are the aspects that I want to make sure that I keep or that I highlight? And you know, even if you were not following the you know, the shot brief of doing specific things, one of those things would not be to remove that tree. And if you got a shot brief and you removed a tree that no one asked you to remove, then you could get in trouble for that. So because that represents work that you've done that wasn't asked for. So you have to control like what you're doing in the scope of what is being asked of you, because you are a service provider. You're not, this is not your film. You are a service provider to the director. And so you have to do what they say. That's on that one level. On the other level is that tree is pretty cool. So, you know, to get rid of the tree, I don't think adds much, and I think it kind of takes away. So I would go back and make sure that the tree stays in there because it's a cool tree. Um, Also on that, I think some of the perspective issues that we've been seeing before, this one is a little bit less pronounced, but it works right here. But you can see that this gets a lot more extreme down here, and so on the perspective. And so I would, like I said, go into 3D and put in some cubes, or if you get access to the sequence, then use the 3D model to figure out what your perspective is. Also, I'm looking at this guy here. This guy looks like the perspective is just a little bit off, and I would say maybe that the scale is not quite there, because this one I think would probably be one of the bigger ones, and so I think it would be about up there. So scale is important too, especially when you take this guy and you look at it and it's almost on the same plane as this, and this is one of the flat gravestones and it's really quite big. And when you compare this to that, this one is really quite small compared to any of these. So I would, make this bigger right there. I would also check your values, because I look at this and I look at this, and these guys that you're adding here that the values, the color's not quite there. So the blue, this is a really blue color. This is a really blue color. And then the values are a bit off. So you look at this here, this is a really dark value. This is a really bright value. So that's something that you can do. You've got stuff in the plate. You can compare your stuff to the plate and make sure that it's more aligned together to do that. So, and I would say that would be consistent for everything that you do here. Also, the integration points. So this is just a little bit fuzzy compared to this area right here. There's a kind of much to do. A lot of things going on at the base of these. So like this here, you can see there's like a discoloration around it. There's some crack and some like buildup of some debris along the edge there. There's some grass and things like that. And so there's a lot of different things that go on to say, hey, this gravestone is actually going into the ground. So you want to make sure that you have all of those visual cues. So even stuff back here, you can see there's just a little bit of debris and it's discolored a little bit, and there's a shadow and all that kind of stuff. And you can even see there's just a little bit of shadow here for this guy, and throughout there's that consistent shadow. So this one doesn't have a shadow. The contact point is really quite fuzzy, and so you want to make sure that when you're doing that, you are providing, like I said, all of those visual cues. So I think this one looks just a little bit odd. I mean, the perspective, I think it's the scale thing. So it's that it's so thin, and because there are small ones, there are really small ones in there. But the smallness of it, usually because it's so thin, it should be bigger. It should be like this big or something. But the really small ones typically aren't that thin because they'd break too easy. And so this would probably be double the thickness if it's one of the small ones. And so I think that's just maybe a scale issue. Like maybe you grab this from a certain area, it's supposed to be a certain scale, then it would be then putting it right down here, it makes it feel really small and the scale is off. So also just make sure you put contact shadows in there, or directional shadows and contact shadows, to make sure that they sit. So overall, I think you need to go through and just make sure that your values are correct, that you got shadows on everything, that you got a light side and a dark side that's distinct. The base color is correct, and the perspective is correct on all of your gravestones, which I think would dramatically improve your image here. Okay, I'm looking at bows, so I'm flipping back and forth, and I can see here that that you do have some gravestones in select areas here, and it looks like there's some good things going on. So I would say that this one back here looks really good. It's got that light side and dark side, and it has a little thing on the bottom here that says there's integration. This one too also is looking really good. I would maybe just on this one, do you see how this this one right here, Bo, has a bit of a kick right there? I think that's what this one is missing. It's missing some kicks. So probably on this surface right there, you could put a little bit of kick. It just feels like the range on it is clamped. It feels clamped, like the top values have been chopped off. So just to increase that, put a little bit of specular on it, and I think that would work better. Um, it's yeah, so I think that would be good. Also, this one here, it is a bit of an oddity, like it's a strange looking gravestone, and so when I'm looking at that, it's a little bit like I'm not exactly sure if it's in light or dark. So maybe just make a little bit of patch here and there if it's going to be like in light. And if not, then maybe some of these areas, I think maybe this little area here, that little highlight there is kind of throwing it off because it has a pretty bright highlight right there. But otherwise, I think maybe the perspective is just a little bit off, like we're seeing too much of this. So let's compare that to this here is this and this. So the angle of those two things, and that's just about at the same level right here, but this one has a more extreme. So I think this needs to be flattened out. I think that's probably the thing. I think the two things when I'm looking at this that's kind of throwing me off is that it's the perspective on it and the scale, because this feels small for like the type of writing and the shape, the ornamentation and stuff. Seems like it should be bigger. So I would play with that. Play with it, see if you can make it bigger and make it feel more right, and then I would correct that perspective so it's a little more flat because in matching this on this guy. Okay. I think this one seems like it's working okay. I would probably, like with these, you can see some variation, like there's a little bit of a more of a bright spot. I would maybe just accentuate that a little bit. And then it feels like maybe the cutout of the alpha is just a little bit incorrect there. So I would just make sure that your cutout shape is looking nice. And then maybe just a little more to do down here to make it feel like it's integrated. And then this guy right here, I think overall, visually speaking, I think this one is just a little bit less I think it's less interesting than what was originally there in the plate. And so there may be some specific, requests by the director to say, hey, I want something else there that's taller. But if you replace it with something that's not as interesting, then I think you might have a problem. So also I think that it comes from a lower resolution. I'm not exactly sure, but this feels a little bit softer than the stuff back here, and that there's a sharpness difference. And I've seen this reference used on other ones, and so I think maybe it might be a little bit soft. But when I compare this to this, this has a lot of nice visual interest, and this is a bit more boring. And so I would just make sure that when you're adding something, that it has equally, or you're plussing it, or has equally as interesting. It's just hitting the note. So even something that you could do on this is which would be a total legitimate way to do it, is to keep all of this right here and just extend this up so that you're hitting that note. The note is to add something that was taller. It wasn't that you needed to completely replace it per se. So if you add that up there, you're keeping all this interesting stuff, and then you're just extending it up. That might be one way to do it. But yeah, I would look at something and see if you can find something that's a bit more interesting. Also, I think there's a complexity difference in the light and shadow shapes, and so you have these really soft shadows going across this. there's not like a, if you compare this to what's in the plate has these really hot spots, and then it kind of has these little more dull spots. The specular quality of it kind of changes a little bit on this. And so overall, like I said, I think the other one is more visually interesting. And if you flop back between it, you can see this one has these really hot spots. Yours is missing some of those hot spots, so I think it feels like the range is not quite there. Yeah. So, but otherwise, I think the integration on these is really good. I think you just need to kiss in a little bit of stuff, and it just needs to be plussed a little bit, and then find something that's going to be better for this position here, and maybe something down here, because that would be visually interesting too. But these are the two hardest positions to pull off, is because these two are so hero and they're such in the foreground that you can't really get away with very much stuff in the background here. It's a little more forgiving, so you just have to be, kind of up your game a little bit for stuff that's down here in the foreground. All right, so we're taking a look at Elinoz here, and unfortunately, when I pulled this off from the Facebook group, it was a bit lower resolution, and so I don't know how much of that is just Facebook, or that, it's just the uploading of it or whatever, but overall it comes to be a bit of a low resolution, so I had to scale it up. So you are seeing a big difference between the high resolution and the low resolution, but we'll still make comments on it here. So while I'm looking at this, I think there's just a little bit of an absence of some shadow shape right here. I do think this is an interesting grouping of gravestones. It does have a repeat. Like when I look at this, I can tell that this one and this one are the same gravestone, and these two and these two, and it's just kind of a flipped thing. And so I think in order to do this, you're gonna have to have something, just change it up a little bit. Maybe break one of these off, or add a little cross here instead of this flat gravestone or something, just so that it feels like it's different enough. But like this little thing right here, whatever that is, that's really cool. And so I like the composition of that a bit more. The repeating pattern of it, I think is that you'll have to deal with. Your shadow shapes, making sure that there's a light side and a dark side. I mean, this and this gravestone are the same exact gravestone, just from different angles. But you can see how this has a hot spot in these areas, which I think yours is missing. You could say that this is all in shadow, but then at the same time, like, why not put a little bit of light on there to make it more visually interesting, right? So, so you could do that to accentuate that. I feel like this one here is a bit blown out for the values. Like, really, we're just kind of having this one be the like the most blown out. It's the most foreground. It does kind of bring your eye over here, right? Which you don't really want to do. This is kind of the point of the shot. We're having to make these changes because that's what the director wanted us to do. And so this is kind of the point of the shot. So if you draw your eye away with something that's too bright, then, that's not necessary. I mean, if you look at the values of these here and you match those values here, I think you'll be okay. And like I said, this is too bright. Maybe so with these. These are probably a bit too bright as far as your value goes. And then I think the shadow side on this is too bright. Probably on this too. When you compare this value to some of these values, I think these will show up as brighter. But otherwise, I think those are okay. I think those just need to be adjusted. This guy right here, I think that the integration on this, the perspective is actually pretty good. I'm feeling it, like it's working. All of this stuff down here. I think what's not working is this guy up here. So you can see how extreme that is. And so I think this needs to be leveled out a little bit, so it's not so strange. So like I'm following these perspective lines they feel like it works within the shot. And so that's, like I said, this is working really well. This little tip thing I think needs to be fixed on that. And then actually, I mean, if we're talking about composition, you know, you got some empty space in here, which would be really cool to put some more gravestones that look, you know, that look really nice and draw your eye to that. And so you could probably add a couple more to that. For the values, let's just do a little bit of a check, or a little saturation check. You can see over here on this left side how it has these weird, crazy saturated things in little parts. And so I would just make sure that you're taming some of those colors when you're putting them in. The value wise, you can see how bright that is. And then if we compare this is just a little bit more warm than what you've got here. Oops. Yours is a little bit cooler, a little more green, and then this one is a bit warmer. So I would have the highlight side be warmer, and then have some variation so that there's a little more. What I'm talking about is changing the specular quality. So there's some of it that's really shiny and reflects better, and some of it that's a bit more dull, like there's moss or dirt or something. But to have this whole space right here be completely all the same reflective color, it's just I think it could be a bit more interesting. Something you could do is actually take this image, pull a key on it, like a value key or something, and then use that as the mask that you're using to have the light shine through. And so it has like little speckles in it and all that kind of stuff. So that might be a little more interesting. Okay, so I'm looking at Alberto's here. So if I flip these on and off, we're seeing there's a lot of gravestones that have been added. I think the biggest thing here is probably there's a little bit of crunching here I'm seeing in this image. When I say crunching, like it's like a sharpening filter or something like that. Maybe that's because of the upload to Facebook, but I don't see that same sharpening happening in other places in the plate. I think it's in here, so it's like this sharpening weird. I think the composition is cool, but I think, like, again, you know, these are the same gravestones, so I think you'll have to vary that up somehow so it looks just a little different, because this grouping is the same as that, just a different angle. Also, these back guys here, you look at the value of this, that's super, super bright. That's almost approaching this value here, where none of the ones in the plate that are at that same level have that brightness level. So, you know, I would, you know, when you're doing this, just make sure that you have variation in it. So that has like completely solid. I would darken it down and then just give it like a little rim light, which would be a lot more interesting and more realistic. This one has that. This one has a dark side and a rim light right there, which is interesting. I do think the dark side is not dark enough, and I think that probably goes with all of these here. This one looks a little bit blue, so I would darken that one up, and like this one is a bit bright as well. This one seems okay, I think, but probably should be brighter. Well, no, those values are really close. So I think that one's probably okay there. Yeah, so I think it's just going through and just balancing. I think your image will instantly feel better after you do a balancing of all your objects, of all your gravestones. Getting the light side and the dark side looking correct in matching. And like I said, you can go through and you can, because there's a different local color to some of these, right? The local color to this down here is a lot darker than the local color of this, right? But if you find something that has a similar local color, then you just grab that from the plate, move it on top of here, and you can see that, and you'll be like, oh, okay, this value and this value have to match. And then you can kind of do a little squinting gag and be like, okay, I need to darken mine down so that it matches. So I think that balancing, I think you just got to go through and balance it all. And I think that will improve it. So on this, let's see. I think the perspective is just for the distance between this and this looks a little bit strange. I mean, it looks like it's traveling a great distance, but I know that that's not a great distance. And so something is a bit strange with that perspective. This is cool to have that where you're varying the ground, but I think also on that you need to put a little bit of shadow on the ground to kind of support the change that you have going on there. So yeah, you are doing this lump, but then there should be a shadow, right? If there's a lump in the ground. It seems like when I'm looking at this, seems like it should cut like right there. Seems like that would be better as far as the perspective, and I think also on this side too. So like, so if you were to cut it like that, I think it's these little extra points back here where it's extending past that. I think that makes it a little bit strange, like it's been grabbed and stretched on both of those sides. So I think cutting that off, cutting this off, and then doing, yeah, yep. So also I would just pay a little more attention to the shadow on the ground, because like you don't have the contact shadow right here. Like this is in full sunlight right here, but this is not in full sunlight, and those two things meet together. So if this isn't in full sunlight, then there should be some shadow on the ground coming across here. So I would put a little more time in detail into getting that, so that shadow is correct in kind of an interesting shadow shape there. Also, you know, maybe, I don't know, like I would maybe try maybe slanting this just a little bit. There's just a lot of really interesting things on this tree in the background here. And it feels like you're blocking the light side of the tree, which has all the interesting bits. So maybe move your guy over this way, or move him over this way, or slant him a little bit, so you're not hiding all the interesting things on the tree. Just a thought on that. Yeah. So yeah, so like I said, I think it's a balancing thing that you have going on here. Vary this up just a little bit, maybe put a little cross right there instead of that guy, and then that will make it look different enough. The perspective on this guy and balancing all those colors together. Okay, we're looking at Eve's, so I can see immediately here that this thing got scaled up. So I don't know that that's going to be the best solution. I mean, the comment was to make this bigger, but the relative scale of it doesn't, I don't think, work very well with just scaling it up. So like if you look at this base and you compare this base and this cross to this cross, this just looks like a gigantic version of this. It doesn't look like it's appropriately scaled because of all of the elements inside it. So so I wouldn't, as a solution to this area, I wouldn't scale up this cross. I would find something new. And at the very least, I mean, keep what's in the plate and then just replace this guy here with something that's a bit taller. That would be probably the easiest solution. And then you get to keep everything that's cool on the bottom, because the way that it integrates into the ground is really great on the plate, and then you're just adding something on top. So you're hitting the note and keeping all the cool stuff. Also, I would say it's just a color thing, just to, right off. This is a bit red. These are a bit cooler, and they seem like they've been desaturated. And so something that is maybe a bit easier is to go through and desaturate things to try to make them feel like they've been integrated. But you can see that these are pretty red, more red than anything else. And so it may feel like it's getting integrated better the more color that we suck out of it, because it's hard to manage some of those saturated colors. So sometimes it is good to pull out the saturation. I think what you've done here is pull out too much of the saturation on these, and so I think what you need to do is put the saturation back in, and of course, I'm assuming that you're using adjustment layers so that you're not destroying the original photography, so you can put the saturation back in. And then just make sure that there's a distinct light side and a dark side to these, because when I look at these, they don't look, there's not like a light side and a dark side to those. And so like when you see these guys here, light side, dark side, light kicks on it. So in addition to a dark side and a light side, I think you need to put little kicks of light on it where the light is shining through. So like this one in particular, that's right in the middle of a light shape, and this one here too. And so you can have little kicks of light on it, and that's going to help out a lot. The perspective on these guys feel good. I think this one here is not working. So if you follow these perspective lines up, the horizon line is somewhere up here, but we know that the horizon is down here because we can, more or less see the horizon. And so the perspective on that is not correct. And so, yeah, so overall, I think it's a balancing in just creating a light side, dark side to all of your gravestones, and then a specular kick, a highlight on that one side, and then just making sure the perspective is correct, and then come up with a different solution on this. Like I said, keep the base, and then just extend the top up so it extends up. I want to thank everyone for participating in this DMP challenge. This is a long video, but that's kind of, if you're doing these daily sessions, then they tend to be just a little bit longer because you're giving very specific critiques on people's work. And so I hope that was valuable, and just, highlight that Dailies, for me in my career, has just made my work better to have somebody else's eyes on it that knows what a good image looks like through leads and supervisors and art directors, and can make my work better. It is hugely valuable. So like I said, I hope that was valuable, and just remind you again that this sequence is available at the VFX Horde, and you can get access to it by pledging, and also the other sequences that are available. And if you make a pledge for all the sequences, then you get access to these daily sessions that we're going to hold regularly until these come out publicly.